Look! Look, the dynamic duo! I got
Hey guys, welcome to the Dynamic Duo. I'm Franz.
I'm Kevin. Welcome to the new Avengers Tower and the new Batcave, everyone.
Kevin, my friend, today we're joined by royalty. We're honored and privileged to be joined by Tom DeFalco, one of the giants in the industry. This is a man who's been in the industry for how many years now, Tom? Like 30, 40 years, perhaps?
Actually, this is my 49th year.
Wow. And you've worked with them all. You've done Archie, you've done Marvel, DC, you were editor-in-chief, you were a writer, you were editor, you created characters, you had an impact that are long-lasting. For example, the black costume Spider-Man, you co-created that. Some of the most personal and awesome stories in my lifetime were done by you, whether it was through Thor or Spider-Man. So you are indeed a giant in the industry. And what I like to do is I'd like to always start by letting you know the impact that you've had on my life, on our lives, and on so many lives. And I just want to thank you for that.
I have to thank you. I appreciate hearing that. It's as guys like me, we spend so much time working, sometimes we forget why we're doing it. Thank you very much. It's the goal was always to entertain and affect readers the way I was affected when I was reading. It's nice to know that some of that worked.
It did. Kevin,
oh, yeah.
I'm sure
yes.
you want to.
Oh, yes. It believe me, you had an impact, not only on my partner and myself, but millions across the world. And I know that for a fact. In all honesty, I can tell you the whole storyline with the black suited Spider-Man, one of the greatest things that was ever done. And it's again, I can't thank you enough for the impact that you've had on people creatively, on an entertainment level. As Franz said, you are indeed royalty for the comic and media industry, and you should take a bow, sir.
Thank you very much. I do want to clarify something. I did not create the black costume or co-create that in any way, shape, or form. That the original idea from that came from a gentleman who sent the plot. The idea was to come up with a black costume for Spider-Man, a different costume, and Jim Shooter later on decided that we should use that with Secret Wars. Mike Zeck originally designed the costume, and then Rick Leonardi futzed with it. I don't know what else to say, and it added some little details to it, and basically most of the people drawing the costume are using Rick Leonardi's futzing with Mike Zeck's thing. I'd like to say that I had something to do with it, but I didn't.
Well, you were there for sure.
Yes.
And were you the writer of Spider-Man when the costume was transferred into the Spider-Man comic?
Well, Roger Stern had done the first plot where Spider-Man comes back from Secret Wars for the first time in the costume, and Roger had decided to leave Spider-Man to work on the Avengers, and I was kind of the fill-in writer for Spider-Man. I was the fill-in writer, and Ron Frenz was the fill-in artist. I remember looking at the black costume and seeing that it had all these other features. So I went to Jim Shooter and I said, "Hey, I know the black costume can do this and can do that. How does this work?" And I always remember he looked at me and said, well, you're the writer, come up with something. And as luck would have it, I happened to be reading, I think it was about whales at the time and the symbiotes that hook on whales and stuff like that. So I said to Ron Friend, it's a symbiote.
Fascinating. So you did contribute to the black costume.
I did contribute the fact that it was a symbiote, and Ron Friends and I figured out, the storyline from there.
Beautiful. What I'd like to do, and I discussed it with Kevin yesterday, is we're gonna break this into 3 parts, and if you don't mind. And what I'd like to do is talk to you about your experiences as a professional, as a writer, as an editor, working for Marvel. I want to get some of the tidbits, some of the issues you had with Jim, I forget, Cowley, I forget his name. Those little types of the things. Then I want to talk to you about your contribution with respect to the comic book world, your thoughts on it, the impact that you had with some of the storylines that you had. And then generally we'll end with just your thoughts with the cinematic verse that's going on today, what you think about it, Marvel in general, comics in general. And then I want to get some quick fire questions, things that we always wanted to know, but now we have a source where we could ask those questions too. So, right. Kevin, would you like to start with the first question?
Well, in terms of your early career, sir, what were your influences? What got you started?
I started reading comic strips as a child. The Phantom, Mandrake the Magician, and Pogo. And I used to, cut them out of the newspapers and tape them to construction paper and made my own books. Most of the time I tried to make sure my father read the newspaper before I cut them out, because if I cut them out before he read the paper, he was not happy. Somewhere along the line, I don't know how old I was, maybe 8, maybe 9, something. One of my cousins, my cousin John, gave me a comic book, which I had never seen a comic book before, and it featured this character. I don't know if you ever heard of him, called the Batman. I remember reading that comic book, and the Batman scared the heck out of me. He just looked like this mysterious, scary guy. But I was just fascinated by this concept of comic books. And I started looking around for them, and I discovered that they actually sold them, where I went and bought candy every week. And so then I was just an avid reader of comic books and the newspaper strips. And then as soon as I was old enough, I started reading Edgar Rice Burroughs books. I think the first one I wrote was Tarzan and the Ant-Man or something like that. And I got hooked on Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard. And later in life, Mickey Spillane and Ed McBain. And, I probably around, I don't know, 9 or 10, I realized that I just wanted to tell stories. So I was always coming up with, stories. I was making my own comic books, even though I couldn't really draw. I still can't. And I'd sketch stories and write word balloons and come up with all sorts of ridiculous things. In school I joined the school newspapers and the school literary magazines and that sort of stuff. And then when I went to college, I started to I figured I should put my money where my mouth was. So I started writing short stories, and in those days there were hundreds of fantasy magazines and mystery magazines. They were all over the place. And I sent out my first story and was working on my second when I got a check for the first one. And I thought, wow.
Wow.
This is cool. And yeah, I don't, I, you know, I remember the check was a fabulous sum of money. It might have been 15, 20 bucks, but when you're in college, buys a lot of hamburgers. I started working for the local, there was a free newspaper. So I started doing reviews for this free newspaper. And from there, I started working for the, the morning newspaper. There was a morning newspaper and an afternoon newspaper. They both had different names, but they were in the same editorial building. It was the same newspaper. And I started working for those guys, and then the college PR office, and just kept on writing. My one piece of advice to anyone who wants to be a writer is be a writer first. Learn how to write anything and everything. Be a guy who does comic books second, because you never know where your career is going to take you. And I used to joke with people that if it had been up to me, all I would have ever done is written comic books. But it wasn't only up to me. And as a result of this, my accountant is very happy. My wife is very happy. We got to make some big money and doing a bunch of other things. So like I said, I'm a very lucky guy.
That's fantastic, because we had the privilege of speaking with Ron Friends, who I know you and Ron are very close friends. And
Ron Friends, the name is familiar.
And
let me tell you something about Ron Friends. Right? I personally think he is one of the greatest storytellers this medium has ever seen.
Agreed.
I have been, lucky and privileged to ride on his coattails for many years, because he's fantastic. Any idiot could work with Ron Friends and look good.
Well, that's
is that
the
good?
funny thing is, he felt the same way about you.
About you?
Well, he was probably drunk at the time. Don't listen to him.
Well, it's fantastic, and the collaboration and the closeness comes through. I want you to know that as fans, it comes through the pages, because those collaborations are, I can tell you, are hugely impactful in my life. They're one of my favorite lines of comic books, and we'll talk about those later. But what I was about to say was that I didn't know this about you, because Ron Friends, the way he explained his career path was that he himself was a fan, and he got the opportunity to be in the industry. So he basically, what I said to him is, he was us who got a chance to be him, which is a huge, huge, cool thing. So to find out that you yourself was a fan, and that got a chance to be in the industry, that must have been a fantastic thing. So what was it like for you to be a writer, to get a chance to write Archie comics, to write Spider-Man, and to eventually become editor-in-chief?
Well, first I want to mention two of my biggest influences were also Stan Lee and Bob Kanigher. And when I graduated college, I looked around for a job, because I believed you needed a job. And I didn't understand that writers don't have jobs. They just sit home and write. I went to some magazines that bought some of my stories, and they said, yeah, just go home and write more stories. But Archie Comics, gave me a chance to work for them. So I was struggling to learn how to write comic books, and I started with one-page gags, and it took me a while, and then finally the editors started buying that, and started buying the 5-page stories. And you asked me what it was like. It was always a struggle, because you're always trying to do better, and trying to struggle, like, and I I don't want to come off as falsely modest and that sort of stuff, but I still think that give me another 2 or 3 years and I'll actually be good at this stuff. Because I'm still trying to, you know, because I look at the greats and what the greats did, and and I am so far from them that that I'm still struggling to get better. Because man, there were some great guys. There were some very talented people in our industry.
They were.
It's always a struggle when you look at their stuff, saying, "Man, it looks so great."
I don't want to jump in because I know I want Kevin to ask the next question, but I just want you to know that what makes the greats great is that attitude of feeling that I'm not yet there yet, and that pursuit of perfection is what makes the greats great. So I definitely count you in as one of those people who contributed, and some of the stuff that we cited. Certainly the characters that you created, whether it's Silver Sable, the Rose, those things, you did it. You are part of that pantheon. So Kevin, feel free.
I couldn't agree more with what you've just said. In all honesty, it's one of those things where, in all honesty, sir, don't sell yourself short. The impact that you've had, either alone or with Mr. Friends, is phenomenal. I would honestly say for comics in general, the way I look at it is that Lee and Kirby were the early age or the golden age of what was going on. Yourself and Mr. Friends were almost or close to the contemporary age, but the way that the two of you collaborated was beyond measure.
Well, thank you. I again, I give most of that credit to Ron, because Ron really is the greatest.
So that's fantastic. So now you get a chance to be Tom, you get a chance to be working in Marvel. You go from Charlie to Marvel comic books. I mean, I said Charlie, Archie comic books to Marvel comic books. What was that like? And how can I put this? So as a professional, okay, all right. So here's a question that I have. And I asked Ron this question, the Marvel way. And since we've been talking about the collaboration between you and Franz, you and Ron Friends, how did you implement the Marvel way of writing with Ron Friends?
Well, initially I had a big problem with the Marvel way of writing. At Archie, we basically did storyboards where you had to sketch out each panel. And I told you I couldn't draw, so I'd be doing these characters in stick figures and using colored pencils to indicate, if it had orange hair, it was Archie. If it had, yellow hair, it was Betty. And, Moose, I used to draw this big square for a head. So I learned how to storyboard. And then I think the next company I was working for, while I was still working for Archie, I started working for Charlton. And Charlton wanted a full script. So when I started working for Charlton, I would storyboard the story, and then I'd translate that into a full script. And then somewhere along the line, I started working for DC, and DC full scripts too. So I, do the same thing. There was this weekly poker game that eventually I was invited to participate while I was working for DC. And I met Jim Shooter at that game, and we crack jokes, that sort of stuff. And at one point, Shooter said to me, "Hey, you're writing for DC. Why don't you come over and do some work for us?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I'd love to do do work for you guys. And they asked me to do a vision story. I think it was a 5-page vision story, and told me I had to do it Marvel style. So what I did is I did my storyboard, and then I translated it into a plot, and I turned it in. And a week or two goes by, and Shooter calls me and he says, "Listen, this plot you gave me, nobody can draw this plot. You can't draw this plot in 5 pages. It's ridiculous. There's too much stuff happening." I think it was 5 pages. It might have been 7 pages. And I said to him, "Yes, you can." He says, "No, you can't." And I said, "Yes, you can." And I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the storyboard. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Jim, I didn't know how to do a Marvel style plot, so I did a storyboard first." So here it is, broken down, 5 panels a page, in 5 pages. And he looked at it, he goes, "Wow, you're right." He says, "I got to talk to the artist about doing better stories."
There you go.
And from there, they asked me to do a couple of other things. I think the next thing they asked me to do was some what if story, and then a 2-part Avengers. Here I was doing 5-page stories for Archie, and suddenly had to do a 2-part Avengers story. And I just kept doing more and more work for them. At DC, they had a DC implosion at one point, where they canceled most of their line. So at DC, I was let go. Still was doing work for Archie, doing work for Marvel. And eventually Marvel decided that they offered me a contract to be a full-time Marvel writer. And the deal was just too good. And I hated leaving Archie, but the deal was just too good. So I went over to Marvel. And I was working for Marvel for a while, and Jim Shooter was reorganizing the editorial department. And at one point he said to me, "How'd you like to come on staff to be an editor?" And I said, "Jim, even at Archie, once I started writing regularly for them, I started cutting down my days. So I hadn't had a full-time job in 5 or 6 years at that time. I'd go into Archie maybe 2 days a week, and the other 5 days I was freelancing." And I said, "I haven't had a full-time job in years. I don't even know if I could do it anymore." And he said to me, "Well, listen, I need to reorganize the editorial staff. So why don't you come on for maybe 5 or 6 months? It's just 5 or 6 months, and then you can go back to full-time writing." And I said, "Yeah, I could do 5 or 6 months." And the 5 or 6 months ended up to be closer to 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
It's Jim Shooter. He took care of a lot of us.
Excellent.
How did the final decision revolving around your initial involvement with Spider-Man come about?
Well, my first involvement was when I became an editor. Jim Shooter, the first question he asked is, "What do you think is the worst comic book Marvel is doing?" And I said, I think the worst comic book Marvel's doing now is Ghost Rider." He says, "Okay, we're going to give you Ghost Rider to edit. Make it a good title." And I said, "Okay, what other titles am I going to get?" Because I figured I'd get all the crummy titles, but he gave me all the Spider-Man titles. And I said to him, "Jim, you're giving me the Spider-Man titles. I'm the new guy. You can't give me the Spider-Man titles. These are Marvel's most important titles. I don't know what the heck I'm doing with Spider-Man." And he said to him, just think of it as Archie with superpowers. And I,
Wow.
you know, and I thought, I don't know about that, but all right, I'll try it. And I started to edit the Spider-Man titles. And at a certain point, I got conned. Jim needed to appoint. I didn't realize it, but he was going to appoint somebody called for second in command. But he didn't tell me that I was going to be second in command. He said to me, "We're going to start doing some children's comics, and you have experience doing children's comics because I'd done it from Archie and Charlton and that sort of stuff. So we'd like you to, work on some of the children's comics." I said, "Yeah, sure, whatever you need me to do." And then I found out they were hiring Sid Jacobson to be the editor. And I said to him, "Wait a minute, if Sid Jacobson's going to edit, what am I going to do?" He says, "You're going to supervise Sid Jacobson." And I thought, "What are you, out of your mind? Sid Jacobson's been in the business, longer than I've been alive. He knows more about comics than I'm ever going to know. How can I be his boss?" And then I found out that the job they had for me was more, they called me executive editor, but it was like they were training me to be shooter's second in command. But they had to con me into it.
Wow.
Roger Stern was writing Amazing Spider-Man for me, and I still think Roger did the best Spider-Man aside from Stan Lee. And at a certain point, he decided he was going to leave and work on the Avengers. So the editor, Danny Fingeroth, came in and said, "Listen, Roger Stern is going to be leaving Amazing Spider-Man." And I looked and I said, "Roger's leaving Amazing Spider-Man? Oh man, you're going to have a problem because only an idiot's going to follow Roger." I said, "Because whoever does is just going to look like a bum after Roger." He said, "Well, yeah, but I got to get somebody to write it." And part of my job as executive editor was to keep track of, our freelancers and who needed work and who didn't need work. So I go to my list on the wall and I pull down the list and I start rattling off names of people who I thought would be good Spider-Man writers. And I'm looking at the list and I'm rattling off the names and I look up and Danny is sitting there looking at me with this goofy smile on his face. And I realized he's not writing down any of the names. And I said to him, "Danny, I thought you need a guy for Spider-Man." He says, "I do." I said, "Well, why aren't you writing the names down?" He says, I don't have to write the names down. I already know who I want to write it." I said to him, "Well, if you know who you want to write it, why are you wasting my time?" He says, "You're going to be the idiot that's going to take over after Roger."
Wow. Wow.
And I said to him, "No, I'm not." I said, "I can't write Spider-Man dialogue." I said, because Spider-Man had a very distinctive voice, a very interesting way of speaking and an interesting way of joking and that sort of stuff. And that kind of dialogue, I said, I don't think I'm good for that sort of thing. I'm more of a Mickey Spillane kind of writer. I didn't think I was good for Spider-Man. And he said, "Listen, Roger did 2 plots. Why don't you script those plots, and then we'll talk about it." And it says, "If you can't do it, you can't do it. But I have confidence in your ability to do Spider-Man." And he told me Ron Frenz was going to be drawing it. Ron and I had worked together. I was Ron's editor, and I had met him once before, and we had a long discussion about comics and realized we both like the same kind of comics. And I thought, yeah, Ron will be perfect to work with. And Ron and I started working on Spider-Man, and we both figured, Ron was only going to work. JR was JR Jr., John Romita Jr.
Right.
Correct.
Was supposed to be the regular artist, but he was also working on the X-Men, and he needed time to get the X-Men on time. He wanted to get the X-Men on time in terms of the schedule. So Ron was a temporary artist on Spider-Man, and I figured I was the temporary writer. I figured I'd write 1 or 2 issues, and people would say, "No, you're not the guy." Yeah.
Amazing.
So
That's
You know, it's funny because people look back on what was the number, 252, where the black costume starts, and they talk about, oh, what a brilliant marketing thing, great sales thing. Nobody thought that comic book was going to sell.
really wow.
When people heard that we might be changing Spider-Man's costume, we got in sacks of mail of readers protesting, talking about how they were never going to buy another Spider-Man comic. They were never going to buy another Marvel comic. They were going to drop it all. The guy from the mailroom dropped one of the sacks on my desk. He says, I don't know what you did, but don't ever do it again.
By the way,
Wow.
I might have been one of the writers of those letters. just so you know.
Comic book fans always hate what they think is about to happen. They always hate it. Oh, it's horrible. Oh, look what they did. Oh. And then when the story comes out, they go, hey, this is actually a lot of fun.
Sometimes when it works. Sometimes, not always. So there are so many questions based on what you just said. There's so many questions that I have in my head, but I have to try to stay focused, stay concentrated, and stay on point, because I want to finish up the edit, the work as a writer and editor within Marvel before we start talking about the juicy stuff about the storylines and things like that, and your approach to Spider-Man and what you think of Spider-Man. I want to ask those questions, but explain to me, if you can, what does it mean to be editor-in-chief or executive editor? So how does that work? So the writer writes the story, they come to you, and you say what? How does that work?
Well, that's something in terms of being an editor. In terms of being an editor, the writer writes the story, and you look at the story, and sometimes you know what's coming, sometimes you don't know what's coming. But you look at it and you ask yourself, does this enhance the character as a whole? An editor's job is to think about the character and think about long term. What is good for the character in the long term? Where a writer's job is this one story, and writers have to think short term. I just have to do this one great story. Where an editor has to think long term. Is this story? It may be a fun story, good story, but does this story ultimately help the character or hurt the character? And the editor also has to work with the penciler to make sure that he's telling the story in the most visual way possible, the most exciting way possible. So sometimes you're looking at things saying, I can't figure out what's happening here. Or, the most important part of this page is the secret handshake, except we can't see the secret handshake because you're not showing me the secret handshake.
Fascinating.
And then you also have to work with the inker. Now, the inker's job is to focus the eye, to use thick and thin lines and black and white to focus the eye, to help tell the story. So you have to make sure that the inker is compatible with the penciler. And most pencilers don't like their inker on their work. They're always saying, oh, he does such a great job on so-and-so, but he butchers my work.
Of course.
Because there's a purity to the pencil line that can never be reproduced in ink. And guys, in pencil, they shade it one way, it looks like one shade, they shaded another way. It looks a different black, they shaded it different way. So they have 4 or 5 different kinds of black.
Mm-hmm.
But if the inker did that, you just have a black page.
Yeah.
So the inker has to decide what is reality, what is not reality. Is this a thin line? Is this a thick line? Do we have shading here? Do we have black here? Inking is not tracing. Inking is kind of redrawing the page with an eye to tell the story as clear as possible, but using the tricks of the trade to get the best reproduction you can get.
Fascinating.
And then the colorist comes in. The colorist's job is to use color to help tell the story. Again, to focus the eye on the important things, to give a dramatic effect and again, focusing the eye, telling the story. There was a time when when the image explosion came out, and guys suddenly, had all these, thousands of colors to work with. And originally we had I think 64 colors to work with. And suddenly you now have hundreds, thousands of colors to work with. So guys were basically doing light shows on the page, but they weren't focusing the eye. They were not telling the story. They were not, showing us what's important per panel, and help us tell that story. The job of everybody, in our profession, everybody has one job, and that's to tell the story. And the editors, is supposed to be the objective viewer who looks and sees if everybody's doing their job, and also, while he's looking at, at all the work, he's also looking at the clock, because this thing's got to get to the printer at a certain time. Now, in my day, if you missed your shipping date, you might as well just cancel the book.
Wow.
Because if you missed your book and it shipped late, that issue, there's no way that issue would even break even on the newsstand. All right? Because it would come out like a week late. It would screw up the shipping of the books after it. Most of the time the retailers would get it a week late. They wouldn't even bother to put it out there. Sometimes the distributors, it'd come in a week late. They'd look, they'd say, "Oh, this thing's already past due. Dump it."
Wow.
So, we had to make our deadlines no matter what. So, back in my day, we always made deadlines. That's why there were fill-ins. That's why, there were many hands would come in at the last minute to ink jobs, because we had to get it out.
I have a question, but Kevin, go again. So many questions, but Kevin, go ahead. Your turn.
If you'll allow me, I have to piggyback on part of what you just said, Mr. Defalco. At any point, if a book was late and got dumped, as you just indicated, what happened to those issues?
What happened to some of them? A lot of them got pulped. A lot of them, appeared. The retailers rip off the top third of the cover. You remember those comics that would show up with?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Those were all comic books that didn't sell on the newsstand.
That's right.
Guys were supposed to basically put them into the grinder, but some of them fell off the truck and got sold again.
So I've got two questions. Is that why, and I hope you take no offense in this question, it's not directed towards you. Is that why some comics weren't as good as other comic books? I've never quite understood how bad material comes out. I've never quite understood the process by which this product comes out and it's really not good. The second thing that I'd like to ask you that's personal is, was it fun or was it work? Was it what we imagined it to be? So the dream for us would be, oh my God, are you kidding me? I'd love to be doing this stuff. At the time, is that how you perceived it, or was it work?
All right, let me answer the first question first. How does bad material come out? It just comes out every once in a while. Let me state categorically, nobody in this field goes out of his way to produce bad work. Everybody is trying to produce the best work they can in the time they have. Now, sometimes, guys were rushed, so they had to leave out details because they had to get that job in. They were called at the last minute. They had to get that job in. There were times when I had to write a comic book overnight because it had to be in. I used to, say that if I had time, my balloons were smaller. If I don't have time, then I'm just doing the first draft and writing a lot of extra stuff just to get it, make sure it's there, because I just don't have time to edit it down properly. And sometimes you start off with what you think is a great idea, and you're halfway through the story, and you realize, wait a minute, there's a plot hole here that I have to fix, that I didn't think about when I didn't notice it, the editor didn't notice. We've got to do a patch job to try to make this as best we can. So you're struggling to try to fix something that ultimately is unfixable.
Interesting.
But you've invested too much time, too much effort, into the pencils, into the inks and that sort of stuff, that you're kind of stuck. There were times when I looked at jobs and said, oh God, I hope this thing makes sense. And then and sometimes sometimes in your personal life, your personal life is falling apart. There are terrible things happening, and you still got to get your job out, and you do the best you can, and then later on you're thinking to yourself, I hope that story made sense. And I know one of the stories that I did. I was my wife at the time was in the hospital, and I was getting, I could see her for an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half in the afternoon. So I drive to the hospital, see her, come back, work on the story, drive back to the hospital, come back, and the editor saying, listen, we got to get this thing out, and I'm struggling to get the story out, and I guess I had so much angst that this story was just full of angst.
Wow.
That readers later on talked to me about how much this story meant to them, and every time I look at it, all I remember is driving back and forth to the hospital.
Wow.
And that story could have easily been a disaster. You try your best in the time you have, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't work out.
So was it fun? And which story was it that, if I may ask, which story was it that you wrote during that time?
That particular story was the one where we find out the secret of Mary Jane.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Her heartbreak and her family.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That's amazing.
So it's a story about her family falling apart as I thought mine was going to fall apart.
Wow. That's amazing. But that's great work, sir. That's great work. That's putting your life into it, and that's great work. So was it fun? Was it fun, or was it?
It's hard to say if it was fun, because I love the comic book medium, because we get to work as a team, and working with Ron Friends was fun. Plotting the stories was fun. Typing plots at 3 o'clock in the morning, or doing dialogue, staying up all night to write dialogues where you're rewriting the same sentence over and over again because you can't get it right. That's not fun. So yes, it's fun, and yes, it's a lot of work. I've often thought that, when we go to comic book conventions, we see a lot of people want to break into the industry because they think that our lives are sitting at tables signing autographs. But I've told a lot of would-be writers and would-be artists, if you can't lock yourself in a room for 8 to 10 hours every day, this is not the business for you, because you've got to be able to lock yourself in a room 8 to 10 hours a day to get the work done. and you also got to know that there are going to be times where you're going to have to pull an all-nighter because the story just demands that you stay there. Used to at night after dinner, I'd go into my office to futz with some dialogue or futz with a description or futz with something, figuring out I'll be there for a half hour or so. So I go in there at maybe 7:30 at night, and the next thing I do is I hear the birds chirping in the morning because it's now 6 o'clock in the morning, and somehow or other I got robbed of 8 hours and don't know where they went.
I understand.
You know?
I understand. Great answer. Kevin?
Makes perfect sense. To that point, if I may, I have to ask the question of the ages. Gwen Stacy or Mary Jane Watson, sir?
Oh, that's the final round. But go ahead. You better have the right answer. Well, actually, no. Actually, I think I may lose on this one. But go on.
Well, all right. Listen,
because you didn't deal with Gwen Stacy.
I didn't really deal with Gwen
you didn't
Stacy.
deal with Gwen Stacy. Yeah.
So I got to know Mary Jane on oh boy, that was going to sound bad. I was going to say I got to know Mary Jane on an intimate level, but that sounds with all of these characters, you have to know them on intimate levels.
Of course you do.
Right?
Of course you do.
So Mary Jane was always the woman that I was dealing with.
That's right.
As a kid, I always thought Peter was going to end up with Gwen Stacy. When Gwen Stacy died, I was shocked.
Oh my God.
I mean, I got to the end of that issue, and couldn't believe it. Thought for sure they were going to bring her back the next issue. I was stunned as a kid when that happened.
You and me both. It's amazing that we had that experience and that you had that experience as someone who managed to contribute so much to the industry. And another thing that you need to be recognized for is the impact that you've had on Mary Jane. You basically fleshed out Mary Jane and made her a three-dimensional character. And that's a huge contribution because that's an established Marvel, lore sort of things. The question that I have is this.
Listen.
Oh, forgive me. Go ahead.
This is an important thing here because I don't want to take credit that I don't deserve. Ron Friends and I used to get on the phone and discuss each character for hours and hours because we felt we had to know each character, like I said, intimately. And so much of Mary Jane, I don't know how much of that is Ron, how much of that is me. Ron and I made a deal a long time ago that we'd say 50-50 because we got no idea.
Wow.
We got no idea about, things. So we always say 50-50 because
fascinating. That's fantastic collaboration.
That was, all of Mary Jane was out of discussions with Ron.
And by the way, this brings up another point that we'll talk about later, because I think that's what the industry is lacking now, that knowledge base, that intimacy, that knowing and respecting the character. But we'll talk about that later. One last question that I'll have with respect to working within the field is, so we ask you now, do you get the impact that you've had on us? But at the time when you were, burning the midnight candle, did you get it? Did you know what you were doing? Did you know what it meant to us? Did you know that you were essentially a star to us? You know what I mean? Like, did you know that, or was it just work at that time?
At that time, you know, I was just worried about my deadlines and getting the jobs done. I was not
Wow.
thinking about that. You know, in terms of me understanding what impact I had, which I'm not even sure I still do understand that. But after I was editor in chief, and you know, I had left staff after Marvel, you know, they finally had enough sense to fire me as editor in chief. And I went and I was writing. When I was on staff, I had to go to a lot of comic book conventions. And once I was off staff, I stopped going to comic book conventions because I thought, you know, if I'm going to work on a weekend, I might as well just work on the weekend. You know, why go to a comic book convention and work all weekend at a comic book convention? I'd sit home and write for that weekend. I was kind of working 7 days a week, and I thought, you know, let me get all my deadlines done. And I used to crack jokes with people. They'd say, "Did you go to any conventions this year?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I went to one, and I'm thinking of cutting down next year." And Mark DeMattis at one point said to me, "You know, Tom, you know, you spend all your time working. You know, you don't realize the impact your work has had on people." And I said to him, what the hell are you talking about? He says, you owe it to your readers and yourself to start going to some conventions. Because there are a lot of people that really want to say something to you. And I'm thinking, yeah, they want to say they like Walt Simonson better. And I liked Walt Simonson better too. And
well, we love Walt Simonson, but we won't use the word better.
and he convinced me to start going to some conventions. And after 2020, I'm shocked at how much I miss going to comic book conventions.
Mm.
So does this mean we may get you back?
You know, I somewhere along the line, I'll be going back to comic book conventions. I have a one-day convention towards the end of 2021, and then maybe in 2022. 2022 makes 50 years in the industry, comic book industry. But, you know, and then 50 years, that should be enough.
Your interactions with fans, what was that like for you?
Well, now it's fabulous. Because now the only fans that come up to me are guys that like the work. So these days, you know, it's good. When I was editor in chief, it was like I was walking around with a target on my chest.
Okay.
I always remember one time I went to a convention. I think it was a San Diego convention. Somebody came in and had a whole stack of all my Thor comic books and asked me to sign them. And in those days, you just sign everything for free.
Yes, sir.
So I signed all of these comics. I don't know how many comics, a whole pile of Thor comic books. And then the guy says, "Listen, I just want to tell you, I think you're the worst writer that has ever been in comics. I think if you weren't editor in chief, you'd never get an assignment. And I think you're the biggest bum the industry has ever seen."
Are you kidding me?
You know, that's what the guy said to me. Some, you know, words to that effect. And I, you know, and I'm holding his comic books that I just signed, and I'm thinking. So I said, "Well, thank you for buying the comic books anyway." and the guy stormed off, and the people behind them who'd heard of it are all stunned. And they're going, "I don't know what this guy's talking about. I'm waiting online because I want you to sign the comic because I like your stuff." And it ended up to be a good thing because everybody thought my ego had been shattered. So they all were saying very nice things to me. But you know, when I was editor in chief, anything Marvel had ever done wrong, it was my fault. I always remember some guy, some angry guy says, at Marvel, all the good artists leave, and they started rattling off a number of people. And I said, wait a minute. Yeah, all those guys left, but they're back now. But they left, but they're back now.
Now.
Now, you can't hold me responsible for them leaving, before I joined the company, and not give me credit because they're back. Well,
Understood.
and I also remember one time I'm walking with Stan Lee, and we just had a discussion with Steve Ditko, and Stan turns to me and says, "Tommy, remind me, why did Steve leave the company?" And I said, "Stan, I have no idea. I was in high school at the time."
Well, actually, that's a very little interesting story, because, and I'd like you to expound that a little bit, because we all know about Stanley and Ditko's attitude in leaving. So I didn't know that there was still communication much later on between the two. And what was that like, and what was going on with them?
Around the time we were doing the 2099 line,
Yes.
Yeah.
Stan was saying, "Gee, I'd love to get an artist who could tell a good story, something like Steve, somebody like Kirby or Ditko or that sort of thing." I said, "Well, we could ask Ditko." And because at the time Kirby was doing his own stuff and doing the animation stuff, and I called up Steve and said, "Listen, how'd you like to take a meeting with Stan about possibly drawing a new series and working with him?" And Steve was flattered, and he showed up, and we met. I forget whose office we met in, and Steve and I were talking, and Stan comes in, and he sees Steve, and he runs over, and he gave Steve this big bear hug.
Wow.
And Steve, hugged him back, and the two of them just started chatting, and then Stan, explained the kind of character. It was a character called Ravage 2099, and discussed the character. And Steve said, "Yeah, this is not my kind of character. I don't think I'd be interested in doing this." And Stan says, "Oh, all right, but maybe we could come up with something else sometime." And Steve said, "I'm open." And then they left and parted as friends. Now,
Wow.
I can tell you that I was at some party. There were years where Kirby was estranged from Marvel,
Yes.
right? That whole craziness with his returning his artwork and all that other nonsense and stuff like that. And one time there was a party, and Stan, shows up at the party, and Kirby is there, and Stan sees Jack, and he runs up to him, and throws out his arms, because Stan was a hugger, and Jack was very happy to see them, and they started chatting, and you could tell that these guys, maybe business got in the way here and there, but there was really you could see an affection there.
Thank you for that, because
Yes.
I think what you just related is very, very important. There's a difference between perception and reality, and what we think is not necessarily what actually is. And so the perception out there is that Kirby hated Stan Lee, and Ditko hated Stan Lee, and Stan Lee's this, and it's great for me, and I think for a lot of people, to hear that that's not necessarily true.
Well, Stan worked for the company. He didn't own the company.
Correct.
And I think a lot of people think of Marvel, they think of Marvel as Stan Lee. And yes, he was the face of Marvel, but he was an employee like all of us.
Yes.
And when the bosses said no, that was it. No. And you know.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And
Now,
there was-
let's talk about some of the juicy stuff. Let's talk about some of the comic books. Let's talk about some of the characters.
This looks like a job for Superman.
Hey, look! It's Spider-Man!
The dynamic duo return next week. Don't miss it.